During the Biden administration, before he did his executive order for the southern border, he had paroled 1.4 million asylum seekers into the country. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on homelessness when we don't have enough housing to withstand the increase in population.
In this video, Ana Kasparian discusses the growing homelessness crisis on her show, The Young Turks. Ana Kasparian couldn't hold back her frustration anymore when reporting on homelessness in California and goes into another meltdown over the state's failing policies. With that, let's watch Ana Kasparian melt down over California and its horrific governance.
Federal government reports that there has been a double-digit jump in American homelessness compared to last year, and an even bigger jump among families.
According to the government's latest data, more than 770,000 people were unhoused in a single night in 2024, up 18% from the year before and the highest number ever recorded.
And those shocking numbers were released by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They looked at the number of homeless people between January of 2023 and January of 2024 and noticed that pretty steep spike in the number of people living on the streets in the United States. Now, what is behind this massive increase in homelessness? Well, if you read most news reports, they just simply say housing prices are too high, which is true. But what's driving the increase in housing prices? Why is housing so unaffordable? Well, we're about to break that down for you piece by piece. But before we do, there's something that you should keep in mind. So again, this data was collected by taking a snapshot of one night in January of 2023, and then comparing it to one night in January of 2024. So the numbers are about a year old. And putting that aside, let's dive into what the findings were. So the report on homelessness was, again, put together by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the numbers are very bleak. So nearly every category of unhoused people grew, with the rise especially steep among children, 33%, and people in families, 39%. The number of people in shelters rose by about a quarter, while unsheltered homeless rose 7%. The rise in homelessness among older adults continued as well, with a 6% growth in those 65 or older. Now, much of the report actually focuses on one of the main factors behind this. So they talk about how the influx of asylum seekers immigrating to the country has exacerbated the housing crisis, because we already had a housing crisis spurred by the shortage of housing units available. And so here's what they found. Migration had a particularly notable impact on family homelessness, which rose 39% from 2023 to 2024. In the 13 communities that reported being affected by migration, family homelessness more than doubled. Whereas in the remaining 373 communities, the rise in families experiencing homelessness was less than 8%. So, I mean, this is, in my opinion, just simple numbers, logic, supply and demand. There was already high demand for limited housing units, and then you introduce an additional population into the country when you haven't really increased the housing inventory, and it's going to, again, exacerbate the problem. And so during the Biden administration, before he did his executive order for the southern border, he had paroled 1.4 million asylum seekers into the country. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on homelessness when we don't have enough housing to withstand the increase in population. Jake.
Yeah, so there's a number of factors that leads to homelessness and the rise in homelessness. So when you look at the different factors, you have to try to separate them out to the best of your ability. So we have.
Yeah, it's a real mystery, isn't it? What they're talking about specifically in this segment with regard to homelessness, that so you have this high demand, low supply problem with housing. Then you parole 1.4 million asylum seekers into the country. I can't really do the math, and I'm not real good at this stuff, but I think that would probably exacerbate the problem. But what do I know? I remember the great presidential candidate Kamala Harris. One of the things she talked about was when she got in the office, she was going to build 600,000 additional homes in the U.S., which is, it's not a terrible use of our tax money, certainly a lot better than a lot of things we're using it on now. The problem, I wondered at the time, is very similar to what they're talking about right now. If you build 600,000 and we're already in a housing shortage, and they add another 1.4 million, I think we're just going to be in a deeper housing shortage. Oh, wait a second. And let's not forget the 10 to 20 million illegal immigrants that are coming into our country. So I take that back. Yeah, I don't think 600,000 homes would have solved the problem. The Democrats seem to like to put Band-Aids on things where Republicans, for the most part, seem to try to treat the underlying disease. I'd say the latter sounds better between those two options. But again, I'm no expert. Let's get back to the video.
Important to prevent this from happening again in the future. You know, California residents allocated $24 billion, increasing their own taxes in order to solve the homelessness crisis. That money gets funneled to nonprofits, some of which are founded by friends and family members of politicians in California. And let's just say that money did not go to where it was intended to go. And there have been some audits that have found wrongdoing by a lot of these nonprofits. But nonetheless, to your point, Cenk, I think the failure of the Housing First policy is that it pursues a one-size-fits-all approach to this issue. And this isn't a simple issue. This is actually a much more complex issue. We do need to build more housing. There's no question about that. But there are people who are struggling on the streets with severe addiction or severe mental health issues. So if you are someone who has a severe mental health condition, right? Let's say paranoid schizophrenia or something like that, you haven't been getting the medical care you need. Just taking you and putting you in a apartment unit is not going to solve the problem. And so it is more complicated than I think some of the advocates are making it out to be. But, you know, going back to the migrant issue, I also want to clarify one thing because it's important. So the data does generally suggest that communities with high immigration levels also experience high levels of homelessness. But homelessness in areas that didn't have high levels of immigration also saw an increase. And it's because, again, it's the same problem. We don't have enough housing. And if you have high demand, low supply, that's going to drive up housing prices. And when people can't afford it, they end up living in their cars or they end up going to a shelter. That is a huge problem here. Dennis Culhane, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who has long advised the government on homelessness data, said that about 3/4 of the increase in homelessness occurred.
$24 billion in California that was meant to help the homelessness crisis. Anna is 100% right. A lot of this money gets funneled to quote unquote charitable organizations, NGOs, and a big chunk of the money they receive is paid to executives within that organization, like big salaries, low to mid six figures. So that money's out the window. And then I've mentioned this before, but when I lived in California, a couple of the programs they invested money in to help with the homelessness problem was to offer needle exchanges for people so they could do drugs the right way. Oh, and don't forget the prepackaged crack pipes, because God forbid homeless people or drug addicts share crack pipes. Talking a lot of money they put in those stupid programs that did nothing. But yeah, I'm glad Anna got to this point that this is a multifaceted problem. More housing is one piece of it, especially with the limited supply of homes that we have right now. People complain about big investment firms buying up all the homes instead of individuals and families. I think part of that is individuals and families can't afford a home anymore. Housing prices throughout the Biden administration, and due to inflation and the increase in prices, an individual or family have to make, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you'll take my word, significantly more money to be able to afford a home. So the prices are so high and unattainable for folks that they used to be attainable for, that the only people that can afford them are these big corporations. And that's a whole nother thing. But two other big factors are mental health issues, as well as drugs or drug addiction. And oftentimes, again, don't have the percentage, but oftentimes those two are interrelated. You know, you've got mental issues going on and you don't have anyone treating you or helping you with those issues, so you self-medicate with drugs and you become an addict and you have mental health issues. And I'll say right now, I do not know the answer for those folks. I think there's increased awareness about mental health problems, but I don't really think we're even close to fully understanding how best to help these people. So getting back to Anna's original point, but stopping the insane influx of people into this country would be a great start towards turning the trend around of the housing crisis in the country. But then there will obviously need to be building, and we will need to figure out optimal programs for those with legitimate mental health issues and addiction issues. And I think that's what she was saying, when there's just not a one-size-fits-all approach. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
Occurred in the 4 states hit hardest by asylum seekers: New York, Illinois, Colorado, and Massachusetts. Along with Hawaii, this is the second factor where wildfires in Maui fueled mass displacement. So a lot of these natural disasters are causing problems with homelessness as well, because people get displaced. There's nowhere for them to turn to. A lot of them end up in shelters. It's just a disaster all around.
Yeah, so to me, there's 3 clear factors here. The fact that it affected, there was a greater increase in those 4 states that Anna just mentioned, all who had migrant issues, right? But there was not as big an increase in California, which historically has had the most homelessness. Is interesting because the migrants were not shipped to California because they just had the normal number of migrants that crossed the border.
Right.
So since they were shipped to New York, Colorado, Massachusetts, and Illinois, the homelessness problem increased at a greater rate there. So that's definitely part of what's going wrong here in terms of the increase in homelessness. But the other 2 issues are also true. So one is we're not directing the money to the right places. And you could tell because with veterans, we do.
Yeah.
We actually do a very good job, and the number of veterans that are homeless now have gone down significantly, okay? And that's because there's bipartisan support for that. Not only does it get more funding, but there's more concern about where the funding goes and the fact that it actually goes to help veterans, as opposed to in California, you give money to homelessness and it just disappears into a black hole, right? And never to be seen again. No one ever gets housed. It's just absurd. But it's direct to veterans, it works. Mm-hmm. So the funding can work, but you've got to make sure that it's actually going to the right place. And then finally, on Housing First, that's a third problem. Because a lot of folks have tried Housing First and they go, don't ask if they've got mental health issues.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
Issues or addiction issues, and no, let's just put them into houses first, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. And almost no one has addressed the mental health crisis.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of talk from our side, the left, about, oh, we've got to address that. But no one ever actually does, right? They do the Housing First, but they never follow up with the mental health funds. So then, that creates a problem where people don't even stay in the houses. So we can get more
like my experience with the left's view on this, specifically on those who are struggling with severe mental health, a severe mental health condition, is they're in favor of funding mental health facilities and things like that, to their credit. But I think where they fall short is the issue of compulsory inpatient care. And I understand people who are concerned about reverting back to a very abusive system that we had in this country back in the 1950s and stuff with the asylums, and they were abusive. But we also have to consider how abusive it is to just leave people who are struggling like that on the streets to die, because that's literally what happens. Either they die or they do something violent that gets someone else hurt, and then they spend time in prison as a result of that. That's not a solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's not shocking at all that 3/4 of the increase in homelessness occurred in the 4 states hit hardest by asylum seekers. I mean, sorry, Democrats, these are the facts, and there's no way to spin it. You know, these sanctuary cities that are fighting tooth and nail to, not work with Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol and to deport illegal immigrants. It's so funny because they think they're doing something virtuous. We are helping them, even though they're fighting us as hard as they can. The people that support deporting illegal folks in our country, again, are helping those sanctuary cities not have the problems with homelessness that you're seeing in a lot of the other areas affected most by asylum seekers. Now, I didn't know that, the homelessness among veterans had decreased. And if that's true, that makes me very, very happy. And to their point, it does show us that if money is used properly, and it sounds like there's a lot of oversight in the money used for that you can really make a dent in the homelessness of the population you're targeting. And then the final piece is, mental asylums or mental institutions have such a horrific history in this country. I understand from an emotional perspective why people would say, we're not doing that. I mean, look how awful that was. But it doesn't mean we can't start over with a compassionate mindset in institutions like that. Because really, I said earlier, I don't have the answer for mental health care for these folks. But as Ana said, some of them need pretty regular around the clock treatment. And the only place you'd get that is inside some sort of hospital that is used to dealing with that stuff and that is specifically there to treat mental health issues, because the alternative, as I think they alluded to, is death just out on the streets or in jail. And again, I'm not at all stigmatizing people with mental health. I have extreme empathy for those people, but untreated, and again, I'm not demonizing them, I'm just saying they have a mental health issue, but unfortunately they can hurt people around them. So a place where they could get treatment is much better than just being on the street. And hopefully, I understand not all, but even if some of them who would have been on the street but eventually go to one of these places, these imaginary places I'm talking about, like, a mental hospital or something, and actually get fully rehabilitated, I mean, that's essentially saving a life, because they probably would have just died on the street. So I have no idea what the public discourse is on this topic of bringing these types of institutions back, but I think it's a great idea. And again, just under heavy scrutiny and supervision, ensuring that people are treated properly in those places, that would be, I think, a really good start towards treating folks that just have mental problems that have not gotten help maybe their entire lives. But we want to hear from you. What do you all think about this conversation about homelessness and some of the potential solutions? Let us know. Anyway, as always, we really appreciate you watching, and we will see you on the next one.